Welcome. I'm Leslie Canham.
I'm Mary Gavoni.
I'm Linda Harvey.
I'm Olivia Wan, and together we are the Compliance Divas.
Hello, and welcome to our special edition of the Compliance Divas podcast on how air and suction protect you from viruses and bacteria. We bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating the regulatory compliance environment to keep you on course. And you can subscribe to the Compliance Divas podcast through your favorite podcast channel or on our website, thecompliancedivas.com. The resources that we mention during our podcast today can be found on the compliancedivas.com website. So be sure to check there. And if you have questions, you can submit those questions to support@thecompliancedivas.com, and we'll be sure to answer your questions for you. So today's topic is very interesting. Generally, we don't think much about the equipment that supports us in dentistry, such as our vacuum and suction, and aerosol transmission plays a major role in spreading SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID. Dental professionals are right in the line of fire when it comes to aerosol generating procedures. And in this podcast, Gaylene Baker, who is a registered dental hygienist and is also with Air Techniques, shares strategies and tips with the divas on how to reduce the risk of aerosol exposure so you can practice safely. Gaylene, we know that you have been in dentistry for a while, and your background has not only been in dental hygiene, but you also understand the inner workings of a dental practice when it comes to the strategy for how a dental practice should be designed and how the vacuum system should be designed. Can you give us a little bit of your history in dentistry and some information about that?
Yes, Leslie. So I am a registered dental hygienist, and I graduated many, many moons ago from dental hygiene school and practiced dental hygiene for almost 30 years before I career transitioned and started to work with my passion with infection control and how to help dental practices, have a safer dental visit. And during my time as a dental hygienist, I practiced with a saliva ejector, creating all of those aerosols and not really thinking a whole lot about it. The mist that we create with our ultrasonics when we're polishing, all the spatter and splatter that's coming out and hitting us in our hair and our eye protection and our masks. So we know we have aerosols, but we didn't really think a lot about aerosols until the onset of this SARS-CoV-2 issue that we've been dealing with now for about 18 months came into play. And now we know how we need to protect ourselves from those aerosols. So I never really thought about the vacuum as being something, and high volume evacuation as being something that would really protect me and protect my team. But now that we've done so much more research into how to mitigate aerosols during those aerosol generating procedures, we know that having a vacuum system that's adequate in place and keeping those evacuation lines clean and using HVEs to mitigate aerosols really creates a safer dental visit for everybody.
Using the HVE properly is very important. I remember when I first started in dentistry, I wasn't very good, and I suction up lips and cheeks, and I wasn't until I really learned how to position that vacuum tip that I got good at suction. But in those days, there was just the dentist and then sometimes one hygienist, so there would be 1 to 2 providers. You've told me in our previous conversations that now we have multiple providers. Can you explain a little bit about that?
Yes. When a vacuum system is sized for a dental office, in the past, the vacuum was sized with a dentist being a full provider, meaning that we know a dentist is going to be using high volume evacuation. So they're counted as one full user. But because hygienists practiced the way that I practiced, by utilizing saliva ejectors and not high volume evacuation, they were counted as one half of a provider. So if you had a vacuum, if you had one dentist and two hygienists, you needed a vacuum that would accommodate two full users. Now, because of the onset of the pandemic and wanting to mitigate aerosols and utilization of HVEs by all hygienists, that same facility would need a vacuum that's capable of accommodating 3 users, because now we know those hygienists are not going to use just saliva ejectors anymore. They're going to be using HVEs. Sometimes dental facilities already have a vacuum in place that will accommodate those new users, and sometimes they don't have a vacuum in place that will accommodate those new users. And one of the ways that you can check to see if your vacuum is set up to accommodate the number of users for HVEs now is to have the airflow of your system checked. And it will let you know if your vacuum is set up to accommodate all of the users that are now currently using HVEs.
I know that Olivia has some questions about airflow, but before we go on to that, I just also want to comment for many of us who are dental assistants in the country, we're doing more and more as independent providers in a treatment room where we have registered dental assistants with expanded functions. And so sometimes they too have even an assistant to assist them and to provide some suction. So we have more providers, I think, behind the scenes that we actually think of. Another thing that I found very interesting was your concept of zone dentistry. Can you give us a little idea of what you meant by zone dentistry?
Air Techniques took the dental office and broke it into different zones. And zone 1 is the patient's oral cavity. It is the location where aerosols begin. Zone 2 is the clinical treatment area, about 3 feet. It's that distance from the oral cavity to the clinicians. Zone 3 would be the dental operatory. Zone 4 would be the office. And we know the closer we mitigate those aerosols to zone 1, the safer we make all those other zones. So if you can mitigate aerosols right at the source, at the patient's oral, in the patient's oral cavity, you're going to automatically make zones 2, 3, and 4 safer. So we will be protecting not only ourselves as clinicians, but our team members and our patients that we're working on and might be walking down the hall in that zone 4 area. So we always want to try to mitigate aerosols as close to that zone 1 location as possible. And that is really what zone dentistry is all about. It's breaking the treatment room up into different zones and trying to figure out what can we do to protect that zone. And with aerosols, the closer we mitigate them to zone 1, the safer all those other zones are.
And that's what it's really all about, is safety for not only the clinical team, but we're talking about the administrative team and the patients who are in the practice. So that makes awfully good sense. Olivia, you wanted to ask Gaylene some questions.
I did. Hi, Gaylene.
Hi, Olivia.
Nice to meet you. I was a former office manager and dental assistant, and now working as a consultant and lawyer. I found your website so impressive and helpful. So really appreciate all those resources. But I was wondering if you could explain to me, what is the difference between airflow and suction?
That's a great question, Olivia. And I'm going to give you something, I'm going to break it down to something that's really easy for us to understand. And we do have territory managers that work with the equipment at Air Techniques that can go into a lot more technical explanation of this. But the real difference from a clinical standpoint is airflow is the amount of air that the vacuum system is capable of moving and therefore capturing, whereas suction is the power of the vacuum. So you need suction, you need good suction of the vacuum in order to remove liquids and debris from the patient's oral cavity. So with the saliva ejector, I needed good suction because I was removing liquids. With airflow, that is about capturing the aerosols, the high volume evacuation. It's also going to collect the liquids and the solids, but it's going to move a large volume of air. And one of the territory managers kind of explains it like this. If you had a room that was filled with smoke, do you want to remove that smoke by putting a suction tip in there? Or do you want to put a big fan in the room and move the smoke out? You need a large volume of air to really move things. And in order to mitigate aerosols that are flying around outside of the patient's mouth in that zone 1 area, you need high volume evacuation that's capable of moving air and collecting those aerosols.
Thank you, Gaylene, for explaining that. Aerosols are on the minds of our listeners because we certainly do want to promote safety and keep our dental professionals in the field. How would you explain how airflow increases safety in the treatment room?
Yeah, so if you have good airflow from your HVE, if it's working at an optimal level, you're going to be able to mitigate those aerosols. So when we have our clean evacuation lines, when we're using HVE cannulas and even larger opening HVE cannulas that we might talk about in a little while, and we have the right vacuum in place, all of those components are part of creating the right amount of airflow to mitigate the aerosols. And when we're able to collect those aerosols, we know that they're not traveling throughout the office, so everybody is safer.
Thank you, Gaylene. Very interesting.
Linda, you had some questions to ask Gaylene.
Thank you, Leslie. And Gaylene, it's so nice to have you today. It's nice to see you. I know we're all at the same OSAT meetings and getting acquainted and staying acquainted through all the COVID issues we've had this past year and a half. And so we really appreciate you spending time and sharing your expertise today. And I'm wondering if you could give us some more strategies on improving airflow and suction, because the way you described it to Olivia made it so easy for all of our listeners to understand. But what should they be thinking about to improve that, Gaylene?
That's a great question, Linda. And there are 2 strategies that are very easy. One of those is to make sure that we have a regular system in place to clean the evacuation lines. If the evacuation lines are not cleaned on a regular basis, they're going to build up a debris in the evacuation system and in the plumbing system of the office. And just like our arteries, when there's a buildup, things don't move properly. We're not going to get the right amount of airflow. The vacuum is going to have to work harder. It's going to get hotter as it's working. It's not going to run as efficiently, and it's going to wear out faster. So we want to make sure we have a system in place that we clean our evacuation lines a minimum of once a day at the end of the day. After very involved procedures, after extractions, periodontal therapy appointments, we want to clean the evacuation lines out. I have an office that has a system in place that cleans their evacuation lines regularly twice a day at the lunch break, because they know the office is going to be turned off for a period of time, and at the end of the day. We also want to use an engineering device to apply the evacuation line cleaner, so we know that it's actually cleaning the entire walls of the evacuation system and not just running right down the middle of the evacuation lines and doing not a whole lot. The second thing you can do that's very simple is to increase the opening of the HVE cannula. Most HVE tips are 11 millimeters in diameter. So if we increase the opening of the HVE cannula from 11 millimeters to 16 millimeters, we now have a wider area that we're able to collect those aerosols, that the airflow is going to be able to capture those aerosols. The other thing that you can always have done is the Air Techniques territory managers have the ability to come into an office and actually put a meter on the suction system, on the HVE system, and check the airflow. And they'll be able to even strategize with the office on ways to help increase airflow without having to completely replace a vacuum system or add on to a vacuum system or do something that's very costly. They're always looking at ways to strategize with them to increase the airflow. Sometimes, unfortunately, to increase the airflow, that's what it takes, though. It takes a new vacuum or it takes adding on to a vacuum system. And, you know, sometimes we've got to invest in our offices and our safety as well.
So true, Gaylene, because, you know, nothing lasts forever. And I know that as a former hygienist and very little of my time ever working as an assistant, you know, you just have to tell patients that, you know, sorry, this restoration is no longer serving you. And I remember those are the kind of conversations that sometimes are important with our clients. So, you know, one piece of equipment, one item is not going to last the entire lifespan of a practice. So I particularly liked how you broke it down to the simple facts as far as, you know, a system to clean and stress the importance of the daily cleaning. Because I know in busy practices, they tend to think, oh, we just did some restorations today, or we just did some crown and bridge. I'll wait till the end of the week because we didn't have surgery cases. And they're not realizing how they're missing the mark on that. But I'd like to ask if you could follow up on that engineering device and talk about, is that like the vortex system, or is it a different way? How does that work to we talk about, you know, not letting something run down the middle of the line? So in other words, are you saying they shouldn't just take like an empty milk carton and, you know, put the suction in there and run the lines? What? Yeah. Tell us more, please.
Yeah, that happens a lot, Linda. And when you think about it, when you're just thinking about cleaning the evacuation lines, you just want to get that solution down there. So you just dunk those HVE tips and that saliva ejector right in that container that has the liquid. And you leave, you finish the rest of your breakdown at the end of the day, set up for the next day, whatever your routine is, you come back and you hang them up. But what happens if we do something like that is liquid has a laminar flow. So it likes to, when it's being applied that way, it just runs right down the middle of the tubing. It doesn't even touch the walls of the evacuation lines. So you're actually adding a step to your day that's doing nothing to improve the evacuation line airflow or anything. That liquid also travels very, very fast, about 25 miles an hour. And when it stops, it hits the impeller of the vacuum system. And over time, that breaks down the actual piece of the vacuum that creates the suction of the system. So we don't want to apply the evacuation line cleaner in that fashion. Some assistants and hygienists and office personnel would do what I call the sip and slurp method. So they're not just dropping the evacuation lines right in the bucket, but they do this sip and slurp. So they're adding air to the cleaner themselves. The problem with that is it's not a continuous adding of the air to the system. And some people might be heavy sippers and slurpers, and some people might be light sippers and slurpers. So it doesn't add any standardization to the procedure either. When we use an engineering device like the CleanStream dispenser that has the vortex technology, it adds air to the solution throughout the application process, and it actually meters the right amount of liquid. It makes it a hands-free dispensing of the liquid. It protects the vacuum from that hard slamming of what we call the water slug. And it creates a vortex, a spinning of the liquid that will actually touch the entire 360 degrees of the line all the way through to the vacuum system. So the evacuation lines and the plumbing all the way to the vacuum system. And that is how we clean our evacuation lines properly. And I know you said like sometimes you would just do maybe a restoration, that you didn't have a lot of involved procedures. There's not a lot of blood, but think of all the prophy paste and the sticky properties of resins that we use today when we're doing restorative fillings. That stuff just keeps building up in there if we're not removing it regularly. And then it allows it to catch on to more stuff and harden, and it will continue to close those lines. And then we're not going to get the airflow that we need in order to mitigate those aerosols. So I always said as a hygienist, when I was practicing, I had other things to do. I had a family, I had kids, I had homework, ballet, all those things we had to run people around to. If I was going to skip something at the end of the day, it would be to clean the evacuation lines, because who cares? The dentist has to buy a vacuum 2 years earlier, right? So what? I've got a life too. But now that I know as a hygienist how important clean evacuation lines is to my safety, my patient's safety, my teammates' safety, and everything, I would never miss that again. I would always make sure that I run my evacuation lines at the end of every day, or more often if I need to, and having a hands-free vortex dispenser like the Clean Stream system to apply that evacuation line cleaner and get the results that we need for safety is what I would use.
Gaylene, that last statement was so powerful as far as, the truth, I'm sure, as far as skipping, one step because we get busy, we cut shortcuts, and it's human nature. And the big piece that we're skipping is the part that's actually protecting the dental healthcare worker, whether it's the hygienist or the assistant. And that's so very important. And I'm learning so much from you today. And I want to comment about that 25 miles per hour speed and some more rationale of why we should give up our empty containers that don't have some kind of vortex technology and be thinking about that, because we all have a vested interest in protecting the practice as well as protecting ourselves and our patients from the aerosols, but it's taking care of the equipment that we've been in charge to help provide that quality care in a safe and trusted environment. So thank you so much for those great tips.
And Gaylene, I think you had mentioned to me earlier that you have a video that we're going to place on our website. It's kind of hard to describe that vortex technology. And when I saw the video, it made perfect sense on how it really does clean the lines. And, bottom line, besides protecting ourselves and our patients, that we're making our jobs easier by having more of a clear field. And then we're also protecting our equipment, as Linda mentioned, which is a big investment for dentists. So I know that Mary has some questions, maybe some more questions on tips and how to kind of navigate bringing this whole suction issue up to the dental team. Mary?
Good morning, Gaylene. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners, as well as all of the divas, are having some aha moments today, and sipping and slurping will be playing in my head for the rest of the day. And I think that the evacuation system in a practice is probably one of the most neglected systems that we have. And it's only now that I shouldn't say only now, but it's becoming more evident now of that neglect as more users are being added to the system. And as we've all been lecturing and telling our audiences to be using HVE to mitigate or contain those aerosols, there are so many more things to that. It's more than maybe having another pair of hands or trying a new HVE tip. It's knowing that your system can handle all that extra capacity. So thank you for sharing all of those things with us. So what are some other things, Gaylene, that you can share with us about increasing airflow? And you mentioned earlier about the tip, the opening on the HVE tip. How does that help us, and what do you have to offer us?
Yeah, Mary, that's a great question. We have Dr. Cook, who works with our Dur Academy in Germany, has a great white paper that you can also find on the Air Techniques website where he did a study that shows that when you have the proper airflow from your vacuum system, so the clean evacuation lines and the vacuum in place that's creating the right airflow, by adding a larger HVE cannula, so that 16 millimeter diameter HVE cannula, you can mitigate aerosols at the source at 100%. So with that being said, if you have those things in place and you can mitigate aerosols at 100%, then we don't have to be as concerned about all of the aerosols that are entering those zones 2, 3, and 4 areas in the dental facility. That's always our goal, is to mitigate those aerosols at 100%. Our Air Protect XL HVE and XL HVE Plus has a larger opening. So it's a 16 millimeter diameter HVE cannula that will help to mitigate aerosols at up to 100%. That's what the test was done on, that size of HVE cannula. And as I mentioned earlier, most HVE tips that are utilized here in the United States are 11 millimeters in diameter. So we have to have a system in place to adapt the HVE valve that's 11 millimeters in diameter and accommodate a 16 millimeter diameter HVE cannula. So there's a little Y adapter that goes right into the 11 millimeter HVE valve that then will allow it to accommodate a 16 millimeter HVE cannula. With that being said, we called it a Y adapter because there's a little plug that can be pulled out. And then you can add a saliva ejector. And remember, I said I like to use a saliva ejector. It's what I was accustomed to. With that, the hygienist can add a saliva ejector so they're getting good liquid uptake. Yet they have the external HVE cannula that's 16 millimeters in diameter, and the XL Plus rotates the head. And now they can work still in that zone 1 area to get fluid uptake and aerosol mitigation without restricting the airflow. When you take an HVE valve and you completely make it accommodate a saliva ejector, which I've seen those before, we think, oh, that's great, right? We're going to get so much more fluid uptake. And you might get more fluid uptake, but you're not going to get more aerosol mitigation because the size of the saliva ejector is restricting the airflow. But with the Y adapter, you get this fluid uptake of the saliva ejector without minimizing the size of the HVE valve. So you still get good aerosol mitigation too. So that is a great thing. I've had great success. I've tried it myself. It works very well. You do have to play around with it like any new device to get comfortable with how you like to position it. But it's really comfortable for the patient and comfortable for the clinician to use to get the fluid uptake and the aerosols mitigated right there at that zone 1 area.
Thank you so much for that clarification, Gaylene, because so many hygienists in particular have adapted some of their saliva ejectors to the HVE lines, and they think that that's doing it because it's HVE, but it's really not mitigating those aerosols. It's not containing, it is just sucking up more of the liquids. But I love the adaptability of having the HVE and the saliva ejector. In fact, we, on a previous podcast, I think, discussed a study that came out of Loma Linda University that states the effectiveness of using both saliva ejector and HVE, and we'll make that resource available. And I'm guessing that we can make this white paper available that you mentioned as a resource for our listeners as well, because the previous studies that we've seen on HVE and aerosol containment are showing up to 90% containment, but that's using a traditional what we all grew up with, HVE tip. And if we're getting 100%, according to that study, I think that's very, very valuable information. And so the more we can contain the aerosol before it leaves the treatment room or leaves the mouth and then leaves the treatment room, the better off we'll be. So thank you so much for that information. But of course, now we have the challenge of, we have this level of knowledge. We have these tips and tricks and things that we've learned about today. So now we have to have some skills or tips and tricks about how do we convince our doctors back in the practice to perhaps have their evacuation system evaluated, or what about changing out HVE tips when the attitude is, well, what we've had and used before seems to be working okay, and we're vaccinated, so it's not a big deal. So any wisdom you can offer to us in that respect would be very, very helpful.
That is always the most difficult thing, is creating the change in the office and getting everybody on board with what you're trying to do to create a safer visit for everyone. I do think everybody wants the safest visit possible. It's just getting people to implement what's necessary. The easiest thing is really to start with the evacuation line cleaner, the vortex dispenser. We also have a study that was done, or an evaluation that was done on 10 different offices where they measured the airflow of the vacuum system before they started with the clean stream solution and the vortex dispenser, and then after. And the results were dramatic, about a 40% increase in airflow just from changing the way they're cleaning their evacuation lines. And the fact that it's hands-free and it's so easy to train the team members on how to use the system, and it really meters out just the right amount of solution and adds the right amount of air, and it creates a safer environment. I think that's where I would start. Secondly, would be to, like I said before, discuss HVE options. I think I have a great option for hygienists and assistants to use. But just because I have a great option doesn't mean maybe a hygienist wants a different option and the assistant loves my option. So try to find a solution that works for the different members of the team. So a larger HVE cannula would be something I would also go to. Have our Air Techniques territory managers in. They've also trained a lot of service techs and equipment reps at different dealers to measure the airflow of the vacuum. We've had many occasions where all of the treatment rooms were getting great airflow, except this one. Why? Why that one? The vacuum system they have in place is adequate. They're doing what they're supposed to do. Oh, lo and behold, there's a cotton roll someplace that's lodged in there. So just by taking the cotton roll or the disinfectant wipe, that one was another one, getting that out of the system, now they have the right airflow that they need, but they might say, I just don't get good suction. They always refer to it as suction. I just don't get good suction in room 4. So I like to work in room 5 or 3. Well, now we can get good suction or good airflow in room 4 as well. Sometimes, like I said, the solutions are very simple and sometimes they're not, but you don't know what the solution is until you really understand what your airflow is in your office and what you need to do to increase the airflow so you can increase aerosol mitigation and help keep everybody safer in the office.
Great. Thanks, Gaylene. 2 things. One is, can you share with us that comparison study on using the Clean Stream system, because I always tell, and I'm sure the other divas do as well, that I always tell the assistants and the hygienists that I work with that go to your doctor armed with some data, show some studies, show some comparisons, and create the case for a change that you may want to make. And if someone wants an Air Techniques person, a rep, to come in and measure airflow and do some of those things, how would they go about that? Who would they contact?
On our website, it has the listing of all the Air Techniques territory managers with
Okay.
the states that they cover, and it has their cell phone and their email on there. You can just reach out to them. That way, they are really looking forward to working with the dental facilities to help them create the airflow that they need, to talk to them about safety, and they would be glad to schedule an appointment to go in and do that.
Okay, great. So we will put a link to that list on the Compliance Divas site under resources for this podcast, so that our listeners will be able to take advantage of that opportunity to help make their practice facility safer.
That'd be great, Mary.
Thank you, Mary. You know, one thing I recall as being a young dental assistant, which I found out was actually not very smart, was how I would close my day out with using the vacuum line cleaner just simply by picking the first treatment room that was vacated by a patient. And it didn't matter what location that treatment room was in, that's where I started first. It made a lot of sense to me. Then when the next treatment room became available, I take this the vacuum line cleaner to that next room. But Gaylene, you told me something very interesting about how that was wrong. Can you just expand on that a little bit for our listeners?
Sure, Leslie. So I would say kudos that you were at least cleaning your evacuation lines at the end of the day. Ideally, we want to start at the location that's the farthest away from the utility room or the vacuum system. So if your office is in a linear fashion, ideally you would start at the operatory that's the farthest away. You would clean that operatory, and then you would work your way up towards the utility room. And when you think about it, it's kind of like when you're cleaning your house, right? You don't just start at the edges and work your way to the middle. You start someplace where you can work your way to the outside area. If you're sweeping your house out, you don't sweep everything to the middle of the house. You try to sweep it to a corner where then you can go out the door. If your operatory is in an L shape, it doesn't matter which side you start on, but again, on either side, you want to start in the location that's farthest away from the utility room. And if you're an office that's set up in a circular fashion or an O shape, wherever your vacuum or your utility room is, you would start at directly opposite that, and then work your way around into like the, the 11 and the, like a clock. You'd work your way around like a clock. So on either side, and until you get to the utility room. And that's ideal. You don't want to drag the dirty debris back over someplace that you've just cleaned. So you want to start furthest away and work your way towards the utility room.
Now, that makes a lot of sense. And I think really what we want to do is have just a quick round robin of wrap up the best ideas that we took away from this particular podcast to help our listeners with reconfirming what they heard today. I did have one question though. Does it matter if your equipment, your vacuum is from Air Techniques, or will the Air Techniques territory manager come in and check any vacuum system and assist you for free with that flow meter evaluation?
Right. They're looking for ways to help dental offices be safer. So it doesn't have to be an Air Techniques vacuum. They would be glad to come in and look at that for the dental facility. And I'm sure they have lots of things they can talk to them about.
Well, that's great. And I think I'll just send this around to the other divas. Mary, you had something you wanted as a great takeaway for our listeners?
Well, yes, and it's a very fundamental thing because I encounter this all the time when I talk to people about making sure they're cleaning their evacuation lines, and they say, oh, but we put a cleaner disinfectant in every time we fill up the water bottle on our unit. I'm stunned that there still is that much confusion between the evacuation system lines and the dental unit water lines. So that's a very, very important thing that our listeners understand, that they're two separate systems that need attention and need maintenance.
Thanks, Mary. Linda, did you have something you wanted to add?
I think there's three takeaways that I'm bringing back to my clients, and I hope this is true for our listeners, is that we should go back and evaluate our current system that we're using, the steps that we're taking to clean and or just, disinfect the lines, and identify if there's an opportunity for improvement based on the tips that Gaylene has provided today. And then second, change the process of how you're doing it. Start with the furthest away and come back. It certainly makes sense, Leslie, to go how your technique was from days ago. We would have done the same thing. And you're cleaning up the operators, you go by which one is ready first. Let's close down each room. It may not be in quite that succession. And then lastly, I would recommend reaching out to the territory manager and having someone from Air Techniques come out and help evaluate your system. Be sure that your system is as safe as you would like it to be, and it's working as effectively as it should be.
Thanks so much, Linda. Olivia, let's have you wrap up our program today with your final thoughts.
I just learned so much. Thank you, Gaylene. And it really shows the importance that we need more of this education in the individual dental practices. And also, you've helped me to realize that we need to add this to our policies and procedures to make sure that these steps are built out into those plans. And what a wonderful opportunity to meet with a local rep to have this meter check on the unit. So thank you for sharing that. That's going to be something I share with my clients locally. So I really appreciate you taking the time, because having been a dental assistant and remembering all this splash and splatter, it's critical for people to be safe, ever more so right now during this COVID-19 pandemic. So thank you so much, Gaylene.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. It was great visiting with the Compliance Divas today. What an honor to be with you all. I can't believe it.
Well, Gaylene, it certainly has been a very informative podcast. I think one of the most informative that we've had so far, and I know our listeners will appreciate the information that they gathered here today. I know that Mary had mentioned bringing the resources, come armed with resources, and we're going to have multiple resources on our website for team members to look at, to watch videos, to download white papers, to be able to bring that information back to the practice. So when we talk about evacuation system and maintenance of, it's not just run the lines at the end of the day. There's really so much more that makes it safer for us, safer for our patients, safer for the front office dental team. And of course, when we reduce the risk, it's safer for the entire practice. So as the Compliance Divas, we'd like to close with reminding everyone that we bring clarity and simplicity to compliance by navigating the regulatory environment to keep you on course. We welcome your questions at thecompliancedivas.com. And again, please check our resources on our website to find all of the wonderful things that we have mentioned here today. Thanks so much, everyone. And thank you, Gaylene, for taking your time from your very busy schedule at Air Techniques to help us understand aerosol and how we can reduce the amount of exposure to viruses and bacteria with airflow and suction.
Yeah, thank you.